The topic that I'm going to talk about is one that I've been working on, obsessed by, upset about, dealing with for the last 11 years. I'll talk about how I got involved in it in a minute. It's amazing, disturbing, upsetting, insane to think about the fact that what we talk about now, post-Holocaust norms of human rights, the ones that are discussed. I was in Parliament today. This is something that in British politics, in European politics, in Western politics, human rights are sacred. Some people call them the religion of the 21st century, and I don't say that negatively. That entire framework was developed as a result of the Holocaust. And it's now one of the principal weapons that's being used against the Jewish people. It took us a long time to recognize this. The demonstrations that you just saw on these, that film that you all know about here, who finances them? How are they conceived of? How are they able to get so much publicity from such a small fringe group where they make us, and they make much of the Jewish and non-Jewish world, pay attention to them, dance to their tune, and respond to their accusations. And so what I want to do tonight is talk about, we're a research organization, NGO Monitor, the organization that I founded in some ways against my will as a result of having seen what went on as an academic at Bar-Ilan, which is my day job. How is it that human rights became such a lethal weapon? And what we are doing and continue to do and can expand what we can do in winning what is a political war. I'm going to try, I think I have, where's Alan, 20 minutes or something like that to speak, and we'll have a good 20 minutes for discussion afterwards. And if I don't get my water soon, I'll fall on my face here. It's been a long day of talks. I'm going to start, I could have started in 1947 or 1929. I'm going to start in 2001 in a conference that was held under the United Nations auspices, the Commission on Human Rights in those days it was called, in Durban, South Africa, to commemorate the end of apartheid. The conference was called the United Nations Conference, World Conference on the Elimination of Racism, Discrimination, and Other Forms of Xenophobia. A wonderful sounding name. Clearly something that was expected, according to the governments that in the United Nations that promoted it, brought in 1,500 organizations, over 5,000 people in South Africa for this process. And what they agreed on was that Israel was an apartheid state. Now I want to emphasize, thank you, that this took place in early September, late August 2001, while dozens and later hundreds of Israelis were being killed, slaughtered by suicide bombers. Every single Israeli who was killed and hurt was a victim of a war crime, a violation of any concept of human rights, international law. And while this was happening in the streets of Jerusalem and Netanya, Tel Aviv and elsewhere, Haifa, this is the declaration they adopted. We declare Israel as a racist. Apartheid appears 3 times in these 3 short paragraphs, sentences really. War crimes, racist crimes, ethnic cleansing, genociding. And what is their third line? This is in September 2001, early September 2001. We call upon the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. You need a microphone? Where's the microphone? Here it is, okay. And so these demonstrations in Edinburgh, very slow. What we saw, the protests disrupted, or the one that in the prom disrupted the Israeli Philharmonic, Israel Apartheid Week, all of these activities come directly from this Durban Declaration. And I want to emphasize that this was adopted as a strategy by 1,500 organizations that claim and are seen widely as the embodiment of human rights around the world. One of the main organizations responsible for this then as now is Amnesty International, based in London. War on Want, Christian Aid, Oxfam. Not all of them were at Durban, but all of them are very much part of this policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. Now remember, this is not about the occupation. This is not about settlements. It's not about the Green Line. It's not about 2 states or 1 state or border disputes. This is defining Israel as a racist apartheid state. It says we don't care if they're going to end the occupation. We don't care if there are no Israelis in occupied Palestinian land, whatever that may be. Israel doesn't have the right to exist. We can have 55 countries that are officially Islamic Muslim states. There are 27 countries in Europe that define themselves in one way or another as Christian, including this one. But a Jewish state is apartheid, racist, genocidal, ethnic cleansing, etc. As Professor Owen Kotler, later the Justice Minister of Canada, one of the leading figures in international law and human rights, said, a conference against racism became a racist conference. And to understand everything that I'm going to talk about in all these activities and manifestations that we see, you have to go at least back to this. If not back to the Zionist racial resolution and Arab rejectionism of Israel, it goes back to November 27th, 1947. I'm going to do a lot of, I'm an academic, so I'm going to do a few professorial things and provide some definitions, and then I'll provide some information and some evidence and some thesis and what can be done about it, which is the main point of why I'm here and where you can all help. Some of us have started to call this the 3rd generation of war against Israel. As I said, you can go back to 1947 or 48. The first generation were invasions, tanks, rockets. When that didn't succeed, 1948, 1967, 1973, 1982. Then terrorism, suicide bombings. It's 40 years since the Munich Olympics. The rockets from Gaza continue to fly. Attempts to kill Israelis through bombings to the West Bank, Judah and Samaria. The 3rd generation is what we call soft power. Soft, insidious, not very visible. The Zionism's racism resolution, as I said in 1975, to label Israel as a foreign, different type of political entity. Jews don't have a right to a state like any other people. That's apartheid and racism. And it was repealed in 1991, I believe, and then back on the 1991, and then back on the international agenda, led again by the same Muslim bloc in the United Nations, along with the passive and sometimes active role of the European countries, who did not strongly oppose this and in fact participated in Durban and elsewhere. And in particular, I said 1,500 organizations. Some of them are marginal. But we follow 200 mainline groups that call themselves human rights or humanitarian aid organizations. And they're the ones who give this whole process legitimacy. And that's what I want to talk about. It's soft power, works its way through the media, works its way through the United Nations, and that's what we have to deal with. The process, strategy, it's a war. In a war, you have a regular set of activities and attacks. You know where to hit, where to strike, where to destroy, where to advance. They've done it a dozen times. From the Jenin massacre myth, 2000, after Israelis were being murdered in an unprecedented, unimaginable way, finally the Israeli Defense Forces went into the Jenin refugee camp where this was being directed from. And of course, immediately after that, at the very same time, we hear on the BBC, first place I heard it, and elsewhere, Israel was committing a massacre. An entirely false accusation. First non-Palestinian to use that language on the BBC was a gentleman by the name of Derek Pounder from Amnesty International, who said he could confirm a massacre was being committed. He was nowhere near that. He didn't know what he was talking about. But nobody questioned him and said, well, how do you know this? Because he was from Amnesty. Because Israelis always do these kinds of terrible things. So nobody in the BBC said, maybe this is wrong. If I jump very quickly to 2009, Judge Richard Goldstone, the head of an inquiry commission set up by the United Nations, the United Nations Human Rights Council, dominated. His agenda is set, his officers are chosen by the Islamic bloc that basically controls all of the regions, or most of the, not the majority of the regions. They have a commission of inquiry to investigate Israeli war crimes. Not to investigate the war in Gaza and the tragedy and the people that were killed, but to investigate Israeli war crimes. It's a kangaroo court. And even Judge Goldstone now admits the Human Rights Council was entirely biased against Israel. The resolution, which he claims to have changed, and I think part of that his claim is designed in order to reduce his own culpability, was entirely one-sided against Israel. His 500-plus page report, quoting all of these organizations, was entirely biased against Israel. All 36 allegations and cases that they claim to have investigated were all accusations against Israel. Not one had to do with Hamas firing rockets into Israel, thousands of them, or storing them in schools and mosques and near houses, and using children as human shields. That wasn't on their agenda. And it's the same process. Israel gets attacked, Israel responds, then there is an outcry of war crimes, violations of international law, and then, it's a little bit like hell, they set up a commission of inquiry to investigate. The results of that commission of inquiry are already determined before the first minute that the first activity takes place, and they go to the usual suspects, these non-governmental organizations like Amnesty and Oxfam and Israeli groups that unfortunately contribute to this entire process, groups like Breaking the Silence, very often the same people changing their hats, their coats, their organization every few months, funded to some degree by our own money, European Union money, British government money. This process has been going on for years. We understand it very well now. At least I do, I think now. Even the Israeli government and others understand it. The NGOs make the accusations. Nobody bothers to check them. They don't know what they're talking about, or they don't care, or they know that they're inventing these accusations. From there it goes to the media. You have a headline in The Guardian, in the BBC, and across the board, American, European, British media. Then there's an outcry, parliaments, foreign offices, in the Downing Street, in the White House, and there's a promise to take the Israelis to task for violating human rights of the suffering Palestinians, and then it gets quoted by academics, like my colleagues. The NGOs reported, the newspapers quoted, the diplomats protested, and we're going to use those as footnotes to show how Israel has become an outlaw state, exactly as the Durban process, the Durban strategy laid out. To do this time after time, is a large amount of money. Some of it we can trace, some of it we don't know. There's some people who claim it comes from Arab countries. I have no evidence of that. But we're living in London. You live in London. I come to visit occasionally. You have Amnesty International, which has had a budget of at least £100 million a year, £150 million a year. It's gone down a bit recently. It's a lot of money to hire a lot of propagandists. Oxfam International doubled that budget. Oxfam is leading a large part of the anti-Israel propaganda these days. Adopting all of the Palestinian allegations and blaming Israel, attacking Israel, poisoning the wells, preventing the Palestinians from having all sorts of absurd claims. I don't have to stand here and tell you, I think you know about these organizations. My point is, there's a large amount of money behind it. Money does make the world go round. This is a huge business. It's an industry. And if it sounds cynical, yes, it should be heard as being cynical. Because Amnesty International, with its huge budget, only spends 22% of its money, according to its own figures, on research, on human rights. The rest goes to feed this machine of bureaucrats and others, public relations, advertising, campaigns, more money to go around the circle. I don't think one has to look very far to see how far these organizations have strayed from their moral claims and mandates. When after Durban, I found out about Durban, some of my colleagues, my professional colleagues, particularly in Canada, were very excited about this conference, and before it took place, I came back to Jerusalem and said, they're going to bring, before we knew what the text was, they're going to bring 1,500 organizations, 5,000 people to South Africa. This is not good for the Jews. And we knew already what some of the language was going to be. And I went around and I said, this is something we have to be prepared to fight. Nobody had any, including the Israeli government, had any idea what to do or even recognize it as a problem. And I began to do research and began to get some of my students, my best students, and some colleagues and others. We do very simple research, very clearly, easily done research, not convoluted, doesn't take a lot to understand. We count pages and words. We look at images. It's easy with a computer. Count every report that Amnesty International's Middle East division did over a period of 6 years. Look what country is obviously the most egregious violator of human rights, because Amnesty spends the most amount of its resources and time. Israel, above everybody else. The second is Iraq, not because of Iraq, but because there are American and British and other forces there, and Amnesty is accusing them of war crimes. Are there war crimes? Are there violations of human rights in Syria? Absolutely not. Because they only got 1/9 of the attention over a period of 6 years. And if you read the reports in the language, and we also have studies of that, you see how soft and mild recommendations, no commissions of inquiry. In fact, Amnesty International has nobody, at least that's the last time I checked, who was following Syria a year and a half after the just unimaginably violent attacks that are going on in Syria today. Libya, this was through the Gaddafi regime, barely more than Syria, one of the greatest, most virulent violators of human rights. And you can look at the other countries there on this list. Egypt, under the military regime. Israel was the main focus of their activities. To their credit, they did do some work on Iran in a couple of years when they had elections and others, but not in a consistent way, not in an effective way. Israel was low-hanging fruit, is the term that's used. It was easy to attack. It was in the newspapers. The political left that these organizations appealed to didn't like Israel anyway, so that's where they focused most of their attention. Who are the people who are writing these reports? Who gets paid to do these? Where does the money go? The money that does go to research. And this is one of the most outrageous things. If you're in London and you have a connection with the political process, the media process, this is where I would say is the most clearly absurd situation, the most immoral aspect of all of this. Three central people in Amnesty International's Israel-related research. I use all of those terms with a certain amount of irony, skepticism. Deborah Himes. Deborah Himes volunteered as a human shield for Arafat in 2002. She writes reports about Israel and human rights violations for this very noble, apolitical, neutral, highly expert organization called Amnesty International. I can't even use the term farce because that's far too mild a term. She works with Salah Hijazi. What did Salah Hijazi do before he joined Amnesty staff to work on Israeli-Palestinian human rights issues? Was he an activist for human rights in China, in Tibet, or in Russia, or in other countries that are close to totalitarian regimes? Now he was a public relations official for Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas in the Palestinian Authority. He was writing anti-Israel propaganda. Christian Benedict, their campaign manager, who sets what's called country response and country priorities. This is what he has to say about Israel. I think it's a little bit too dark, and I apologize, the writing is not quite as clear as it should be. It's a big conspiracy. The United States generates money, power, control. Israel pushes the buttons. What's the big problem in the Middle East for Mr. Benedict and Amnesty International? That states like Syria and Lebanon feel insecure. It's not Assad massacring Syrians and Halab, Damascus. It's Israel pushing buttons. Israel's among the list of stupid dictatorial regimes, along with Burma, North Korea, and Iran. This is a man who hates. And he is Amnesty International's, UK's rather, campaign manager, and on and on. I shouldn't do this too long because it gets bad press, so I'll give you one more aspect of Amnesty's campaign. Amnesty works closely with a gentleman by the name of Ben White, who is one of the most vicious haters of Israel. Writes books like Palestinians and Israel, Segregation, Discrimination, and Democracy. Promotes a brand of Christian theology, which is historically anti-Semitic, continues to be. All these events took place under Amnesty's support or in their co-sponsorship. He's not a member of the Amnesty official group, but he works very closely with Christian Benedict and others. I'll just tell you, I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about some of the things that we do, but Amnesty does urgent actions. It's been doing this since the 1960s to help where individuals and groups are threatened by human rights violations. So we put on urgent action, copied their format. You can't read all of this, and I don't think we have enough. Do we have copies here? I don't think so, but we do. Okay, we have a few copies, and it's available on our website, this urgent action, in which we called on Amnesty, people who support Amnesty, people who have contact with Amnesty, not just to protest, but to demand that these people be not in a position to write so-called research reports on Israel. If they want to do China, they want to do, if they think that they're qualified to do human rights elsewhere, that's not our business. But to write reports about Israel is a travesty. Human rights organizations, Amnesty, and I'm mostly going to be talking about the ones that are well known and based in the UK. If anybody wants to talk about others, we can do that afterwards. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, particularly Human Rights Watch, 2009, were marketing the Gaddafi family as human rights reformers. Some of you may know that LSE, which I think is a respected, at least was a respected academic institution, accepted tens of millions of pounds from the Gaddafi family, which also was accompanied by a doctoral degree, not an honorary doctorate, a real doctorate, for Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes now. The LSE said, it's okay to accept this money. We accepted it because we were told they were human rights reformers. Who gave them the credit for being human rights reformers? These respected organizations, highly respected human rights watchdogs. Have they apologized? Have they ever acknowledged that they were wrong? No. They're very powerful political actors who've never really been called on the carpet there. They attack us when we point this out. And that's part of the, I'd say, the successes that we've had that I'll talk about. But it hasn't hurt their funding, it hasn't hurt their prestige. They still go to the Foreign Office. Why would anybody in the British government or the American government or the United Nations take them seriously? But they have what we call this halo effect, this facade of actually caring about human rights. And it's all marketing. In 2009, a Human Rights Watch delegation made a trip to Saudi Arabia, a rare event. You would think, especially because the head of the Middle East Bureau, a woman by the name of Sarah Leah Whitston, was heading that delegation, that she would go and talk to the Saudis very sternly about the oppression of women. Maybe even take a car and drive it around the block. What did she go do? She asked for money. What was the money to be used for? To attack Israel. For the Goldstone report. Richard Goldstone was a member of the Human Rights Watch International Board. They wanted, Goldstone was very much the creation of Human Rights Watch. And this was a fundraising effort in Saudi Arabia. I'm going to make sure I keep on time. Somebody let me know when I have 5 minutes left so I can go through the end quickly. There's there's a lot of material here. I want to make sure that you have as much ammunition as you can so that you can respond to a lot of these campaigns. The organizations that now control the human rights agenda make accusations which are usually unverifiable, unsourced, and unreliable. As I said, they get picked up by the media. They consistently erase the context of terror. Israel is attacking, intentionally killing civilians. Why? Because Israel is an evil country. Not because Hamas controls Gaza and is attacking Israel. Every rocket attack from Gaza is a war crime. Every single one, because it's intentionally designed to kill civilians. Sometimes they succeed, but it doesn't make any difference. It's the intention. The rockets and missiles are stored and moved around in houses and civilian vehicles, in schools and in mosques and in hospitals. All of these are war crimes in different forms. These are never in these reports, or almost never. Occasionally we get a token report which is printed and then forgotten about. No campaigns, no investigation, no international sanctions. Then they make up international law. Gaza, they say, is subject to collective punishment. That's a terrible thing, collective punishment. The Nazis did collective punishment. Israel's like the Nazis, right? Collective punishment. They don't say that when there are blockades and sanctions in 25 other places in the world where there are conflicts, they will never use the term collective punishment. They made this up for this situation. And then journalists, diplomats, others say, well, these are experts. They must know what they're doing. They say it's a violation of international law, then it must be so. And of course, the double standards that we see. The only targets that with this language and these aspects are used are against Israel. So they make these accusations, and immediately it appears across the media, without question. I'll give you some very recent examples in a minute. And we call that the halo effect. If a general, Israeli, British, American, were to appear on television, be interviewed, and the journalist would say, well, you bombed this village in Afghanistan, and the people there say that you killed innocent civilians and there was no military necessity. Isn't that a war crime? And the general would say, absolutely not. It's a false accusation. It's a lie. How many journalists would write down and the general show that it was a lie, and that would be the headline? They would all investigate. They would be skeptical. Why are they never skeptical when these organizations make these inventions and accusations? They're not doing their job. It's highly unprofessional. And all of these examples illustrate that repeatedly. They're not the experts they claim to be. When you mix this type of bias, or some people, I'll say it differently, I'm often asked, why? What is it that motivates these organizations? Why are they so anti-Israel? The different factors. One is you follow the media. If you want to actually be taken seriously and the media is focused completely disproportionately against Israel, with the media, you write reports against Israel. You make accusations against Israel. You run campaigns against Israel. The Durban Conference, all of the UN activities, all of this public relations. Why? Because the organization of the Islamic Conference, 55 countries, is the largest bloc in the United Nations. If Tehran and Algeria, Morocco, Yemen, and other countries decide that this is what they're going to focus on, if you're a non-governmental organization like Amnesty, and you want to speak in the United Nations and keep your pass and be visible and make your money by showing that you're in the news and you're important, then you better not contradict their party line, which is that Israel is an apartheid, racist, unacceptable state. But the third factor, and the one that I find most disturbing when I'm in the UK, in Europe to some degree, but the UK particularly, two or three of these images, the two here are both UK images, War on Want, Christian Aid, is this layer of coarse, old-style anti-Semitism, theological anti-Semitism. replacement, substitution, supersessionism. The Jews are killing Jesus again. That's what that Christmas card that we see in the middle is. That's the theme. Israel's wrong because they're Jews. And we're going to use the themes that are familiar to churchgoers, theological themes, to attack Israel. Christian Aid ran this big campaign. There was posters, giant posters in the tube stations and elsewhere with the video in the churches of this child that was suffering on Christmas in Bethlehem because of the evil Israeli soldiers. These are Christian themes, and of course you don't have to have an explanation to look at the third poster, which won a cartoon contest prize run by a very prominent Palestinian refugee organization, all funded by European governments in different ways. When we protested, they took the picture down. The organization will continue to promote this agenda. They didn't apologize. Nobody lost their position. Well, maybe one person lost their position as a result. But it just shows you the viciousness that's in there. No at all hesitation to use this type of propaganda. These are the organizations that are behind all of these protests, the disruptions, what's called the BDS movement. They wouldn't exist. It's the day-to-day pounding. It's in The Guardian, it's in the BBC, it's in the House of Commons, it's in the House of Lords. It's around the world that facilitates these kind of boycott movements. The poster in the middle with the blood orange, the theme of blood libel that's been with us for hundreds of years, that's an Oxfam poster. You may not be able to see the symbols at the bottom, but it says don't visit, don't buy Israeli products, don't visit Israel, don't go to Israeli concerts, don't do anything with Israel. Israel is responsible for the bleeding of the suffering. Not Syria, not Libya, not any place else, but Israel. We tend to look at these organizations as marginal group of crazy people. You have to realize how much money and power is behind them. Christian Aid gets money from the British government, outsourcing its humanitarian aid. Probably over 100 million pounds at least a year. Co-produced a film with an organization called, they funded a film, an organization called Adala, an Israeli-Arab organization. What's the theme of the film? Palestinian Arabs, Israeli Arabs, are discriminated against, institutionalized and intentional by Jews living in a self-defined Jewish state. This is part of the campaign to demonize Israel as a Jewish state. It's not about the occupation. It's not about settlements. When I speak to, I will say, audiences that I know are more left-wing and blame Israel, I ask them, what has this got to do with occupation? Organizations that support what are called targeted boycotts of Israeli products to get Israel to get out of the occupied territories. This is not about occupied territory. Israel will get out tomorrow, and exactly the same type of propaganda attacks will continue. What do we do about all of this? That's really what I want to talk about. How much time do I have? A few more minutes, okay. Nobody's yelling at me to stop. I want to spend some time talking about, I don't want to leave audiences with depression. We have enough things to worry about. I think it's important to see that we are beginning to see changes. Pushback is succeeding, piece by piece. That may not appear here is going to be the most difficult place to see that because of the strong entrenchment of organizations like Amnesty and Oxfam and to some degree Human Rights Watch and others. War on One, plus all the Israeli and Arab groups that come here and see this as very fertile ground. The first thing that we do, because we're talking about moral claims, is to expose the immorality of their own actions. We call that naming and shaming. When Israel is singled out for hatred, for false accusations, biases, many of the examples that I showed you, when that's written about in newspapers, and there are some good people, I showed you some examples, the expose of the Saudi funding by Human Rights Watch, the Gaddafi marketing work that we do, the research that we do then gets into the hands and gets published in places, sometimes in the Telegraph, sometimes in the Wall Street Journal, European edition, some places, sometimes in other places. I'll give you some more examples where the naming and shaming plays a very important role. Proving that the accusations are false. Goldstone withdrew, repudiated his own report, not easily, not nearly as clearly and vocally as he should have, but I give him credit. He wrote an article in a prominent American newspaper that said they were wrong. And that was because, for at least a year, NGO Monitor and a few others continued to press day after day, week after week, the complete inconsistencies of that report. That report was designed and concluded with the recommendation to go to the Security Council and then the International Criminal Court to deprive Israel of its legal system by imposing on Israel the conditions of the International Criminal Court, like it's done for genocidal leaders in Rwanda or in former Yugoslavia or in Congo and other places. Israel's just like those countries. Korea, Libya. And by repeatedly demonstrating the Goldstone report was entirely fictitious, Judge Goldstone himself recognized the importance of saying we were wrong. So you can make some progress in this. Perhaps most importantly, what we call follow the money, identifying who's paying for it. If you're paying for an organization, if your money is going to a lot of these organizations as taxpayers, if you're a European or British official making the decisions about funneling money to these organizations, you share responsibility. And by holding the funders accountable in different ways, largely through publicity, sometimes through legal processes, they're much more aware of the damage that they're doing through this funding, and some of them are reducing or ending the funding for some of the most virulent organizations. Even the Ner Yisrael Fund has stopped funding some of the worst groups because we've held them responsible. And talking to the journalists and diplomats, the ones who are willing to listen, and showing all of these activities and gaining their support and reversing this process. Now, I'll give you some examples quickly. A lot of the examples I brought were from Human Rights Watch. After a number of meetings and exchanges of correspondence and details, the founder of Human Rights Watch in New York, Robert Bernstein, renounced his own organization. Editorial page of the New York Times. It's a short excerpt, but the entire article was renouncing his organization. Very difficult thing to do for someone who had set up this idealistic human rights-based organization that fought, among other things, for the release of Sharansky and others from the Gulag. The organization had been taken over and perverted from its original goals, and he had the courage to speak out against that. And not only in this article, but in many other examples as well. So naming and shaming does work. It cost Human Rights Watch its prestige, significant funding, and impact. Not enough. Another example of some of the work that we do, we talked about following the money. There's an organization called Electronic Intifada, which sounds like a small website that nobody pays attention to. But if you look at some detail, the Israel Apartheid Weeks on university campuses, the BDS campaigns, a lot of the propaganda in this area is connected to Electronic Intifada. Their people appear dozens of different places to speak exactly on these issues. And we were wondering for many years where they get their money from. Well, some of that money, at least, comes from the Dutch government through an organization like Christian Aid, Christian Dutch version of the outsourcing humanitarian aid from governments. And buried in their 124 million euros, this was 2008, so they probably have a little bit more now, less now. 2 or 3 items, in other words, actually it's higher than 150,000 euros a year, went to electronic intifada. Of course, the foreign minister and the government didn't know that because they give a large chunk of the government to the church-based organization, and then it gets filtered down, and nobody reports. And to his credit, the Dutch foreign minister looked into this and demanded that this type of abuse end. The British government has stopped funding, not enough, but for 5 organizations that should never have been funded in the first place. The Canadian government has stopped funding for a lot more. They were the ones who also paid for the first Durban conference, having recognized, this is a different government, but that the predecessors had contributed so much to this campaign and been among the leaders in making sure that it doesn't get repeated. And a number of other foundations and governments have been started to cut back. I think we're seeing the beginning of the end, but it will take 10 more years of work to see that a lot of this money gets cut out. I mentioned Goldstone's reconsideration and retraction, for which he admits that he did not have the evidence that civilians, the main point of this 500-page report, that Israel was guilty of intentionally targeting civilians was not, in fact, the case. And courageously, because he was slammed and attacked, and still is, by his colleagues who thought he was part of them in all these campaigns, he had the courage to say no. We've published books. The Goldstone Reconsidered, we call it, from his own language, critical analysis, so that in 400 law schools around the world, anytime a student, we have also electronic versions of this, you can download it without a cost from our website. It's a little bit thick, it's not great bedtime reading. But anytime a law student will study the Goldstone report, they'll also have a very detailed, learned, legal analysis of everything wrong in the Goldstone report. And we made sure that that book was published. One of the chapters is called the UN's Book of Judges. Some very clever, well-written articles in the book. I want to spend the last couple of minutes just talking about something that happened just a week or so ago. 2003, in the middle of this terror war that was run by the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat, in which over 1,000 Israelis were killed and thousands more were injured, there was an organization called the International Solidarity Movement that would take young students and send them to interfere with Israeli anti-terror organizations, operations. One of these students was named Rachel Corrie, and in the process of trying to prevent an IDF operation, in those days, had it succeeded, would have saved a lot of lives, destroying some of the early tunnels that were built to smuggle in weapons into Gaza. And she was killed when a tractor, a bulldozer operator, did not see her standing in front of there. We don't know who directed her to stand there, but the International Solidarity Movement is clearly responsible in many ways for that. This happened in 2003. Her parents then became completely devoted to the anti-Israel cause, Palestinian cause, and they sued the Israeli government, the IDF, for her death, over her death. And the lawsuit, which lasted at least a year, testimony by many people was taken. The verdict was read out in a court in Haifa. This was about a little bit over a week ago. Actually, I think exactly a week ago, something like that. August 28th. Within 5 minutes of when the verdict was announced, before anybody could read the 62-page judgment in Hebrew, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had issued statements condemning the verdict. They didn't have any idea what was in the verdict except what the judge summarized. And exactly, it has been going on since Jenin, all the way through the Goldstone report, that the Israeli justice system is fatally flawed. In The Guardian, those words were quoted. The expert Human Rights Watch official said, but not the New York Times, because the New York Times originally published it in their internet edition, called the New York Times and pointed out that this individual from Human Rights Watch is not an expert. He clearly could not have known anything about the verdict other than the brief statement the judge made, and the things he said were completely unsupported. And we pointed out to her how this had happened time after time again. He was gone. The report was rewritten. When the printed edition came out, he was not there. So slowly but surely we are making progress with key individuals. I don't think that the British ambassador, Matthew Gould, would take these words very seriously, the words of these NGOs, and others, because they've seen how completely false they've been. Naming and shaming. In the BDS movement, there's a professor by the name of Judith Butler, who is supposed to get an award next week by the city of Frankfurt. It's called the Theodore Adorno Award. One of the other aspects of Ms. Butler is that she is one of the Jewish proponents, supporters of the BDS movement. Her behavior, her actions are fundamentally immoral in the way she attacks and singles out Israel. If somebody asks me why, I'll tell you I'm not a psychologist, I don't know. But I don't care what the reason is, it's wrong. Her words, her actions, whether she's Jewish or not Jewish, are irrelevant. The support for the elimination of Israel through the BDS movement is fundamentally immoral. It was in Durban and it is today. She should not be getting an award. Theodore Adorno, in 1967, protested very clearly the singling out of Israel for attack after the 67 war. And yet she's getting a prize named after him. Someone who referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as progressive social movements. But because we criticized her, she's now come out viciously attacking NGO monitoring, and I think that's a good sign. Because what it says is that they're paying attention. That these activities are seen and understood as threatening their privileged position, their ideology, their warfare. That's our job to do that. There's a blog called The Angry Arab, which is very much involved in the attacks against Israel. And in his response to all of this, he criticized Judith Butler for defending herself against the attacks. She talked about being in Jewish tradition and what I call the new religion of Tikkunism. And that was consistent with her Jewish values. But the main point I want to point out is that one of the sentences he put in there: when our enemies put us on the defensive, they win. We've managed to put her on the defensive. We put Human Rights Watch on the defensive. We've started to put Amnesty International, people like Christian Benedict, on the defensive. Ben White and others. If you're going to win a war, you have to put the other side on the defensive. You never win a war if all you do is defend yourself. And you don't want to give these enemies of the Jewish people an opportunity to say, well, we're accepted by large parts of the community. We disagree over some of the details. This is not a disagreement over detail. This is a very vicious, dangerous war. And in order to win that war, we have to understand what we're facing. We have to deal with it seriously. A few final remarks, what you can do. We have an email list, we have a website, we send out about once a week a detailed analysis of one of these issues. No cost. We think it's very important that people understand what they're up against, so we encourage subscriptions to the email list or visiting our website. I think it's very important. I talked to an audience which I assume was pretty friendly, otherwise she wouldn't be here, wouldn't be in the shul. But very large parts of Jewish and non-Jewish community are very unaware. When I talk to people about, maybe less now than a year or two ago, when I talk about Amnesty, and people say, but they do wonderful work in China and other places. They don't know the details. They still accept that halo effect. Whenever an organization is quoted in the newspaper as expert, we make sure that that organization is criticized, and we need more people to do that. You write a letter to the editor, you make a protest in some ways when these groups are considered to be experts, whether it's through the MPs that make both of them or any other framework. We work with the ZF and other organizations to make sure that information is disseminated and available and effective. There are other recommendations, talking to the organization, the officials who fund these organizations. We were in Manchester, my colleague and I, just say the room, Reuben, Eaton and I were in Manchester at the beginning of the week. And in that framework, when we were there, we understood that the British General Council General from Jerusalem, which is basically the ambassador to the Palestinians, was speaking in Manchester the next day. And we provided information for the people there, for the Zionist group, to go and ask him, why is it that your government, which supports two states and supports a peaceful settlement, gives a lot of money to organizations which oppose the right, oppose two states because they oppose the right of Israel to exist and keep the conflict going? The more information you have, the more protests you're able to make, and the more questions will be raised about British funding going to these organizations. European Union funding, I say that all of you are paying twice, once to British support and sometimes to the same organizations. So all this information we think is important. This is our website. For those of you who are fluent in Hebrew, there's a Hebrew version of this. For the French, there's a French version. I prefer the English version. I thank you for your attention.